Right now, imagine your avatar, your protagonist. Get them in your mind. Good. You know how tall they are, how much they weigh, their hair color or their absence of hair. Do you also know what drives them and the wound that caused that? Good, because that's what drives your story. And we're going to call that the story dynamics. I'm Jule Kucera, creator and founder of StoryJoules and also this way of looking at story dynamics. I help writers craft powerful stories. So often we focus on the external plot of the story, but it isn't the car chase or the dead body or the decision to leave home and go to college that propels the story forward. It's the emotion behind that action. In this video, you'll see the 4 internal story dynamics at work in stories. This, as well as the other story dynamics, are well described in the Story Dynamics Quick Guide, which you can get free by clicking the link in the description. The foundation is always the 2 dimensions, the external dimension of order and chaos, the internal dimension of stasis and change, and how that chaos puts pressure on our avatar to change. I like graphics, but I also like words, so let's put it in words. For an avatar to change, they must be pressured in the external dimension of order and chaos and transformed, or not, in the internal dimension of stasis and change. But what does this have to do with story dynamics? Story dynamics determine how the avatar is pressured externally and how they are demanded to change internally. Let's start with the 4 internal story dynamics, the 4 that tell us how the avatar is being demanded to change. The first one, the number 1 story dynamic, shows up in more stories than any other. If it isn't the primary dynamic in a story, it's often secondary. Whether that story is a crime story, a war story, an action story, it's frequently there. Do you know what it is? You are right. It's love. Story dynamics are determined by the values at stake. What's the value at stake in the love story dynamic? Well, obviously love. And the question the protagonist, and actually not just the protagonist, but also the love interest, they both ask themselves is, will I sacrifice for this love? And the bigger the sacrifice, the more powerful the love story. And this is the internal dynamic. So the important part of the question is not external. Will I cut off my hair to buy a chain for his watch? It's internal. Am I willing to sacrifice my hair, the thing that most defines my beauty, for him? In Pride and Prejudice, Jane must sacrifice her prejudice and Mr. Darcy must sacrifice his pride, or it's the other way around. It seems to work both ways for them. In Me Before You, Louisa must sacrifice her belief that she doesn't deserve a life she loves. And Will must sacrifice his belief that he doesn't need anyone. We know those sacrifices happen because we see the result in their action. He asks her to come to Switzerland. She gets on a plane and into his bed to love him, to do the thing that he wants from her, not the thing that she wants to do. And I can tear up just thinking about it. Every value at stake in a story dynamic rides on a scale. Generically, the scale is positive, compromise positive, negative, and then double negative, which Robert McKee calls the negation of the negation. And of course, there are all kinds of gradations between those. In a love story, the dynamic is love, compromise love, hate, and hate masked as love. In the book Gone Girl, or the movie too, the idea that you would blackmail your husband to have a baby, I think that's at the negation of the negation. It looks loving, we're having a baby, but it is not loving at all. And if you're wondering, what about the person who sacrifices too much, who loses themselves in a relationship? Well, maybe that's compromised love, where they are engaged in a trade-off, or in the extreme, potentially hate masked as love, where the person they hate is not the other person, but themselves. And so they give themselves away. And I honestly don't know where to put Anna Karenina on this. So if you've got thoughts, please put them in the comments. I'd love to hear. The love story dynamic is unique. It is the only one that is both internal and external. We'll talk about the external dimension of the love story dynamic, of the love dynamic next week. But it's the reason that this particular story dynamic is so useful and why it shows up so often. One is, of course, we want to be loved, but the other is because it works both externally and internally. It's like a Swiss Army knife. It's very handy. That's it for now for the love internal dynamic. Let's now move on to the other 3. Validation. Validation scale is from internal validation, where I validate myself, to compromised internal validation, to external validation, where I'm looking externally for my validation, to external validation masked as internal, which could also be called selling out. For example, an attorney who leaves the law career they hate to become an author could be moving up the scale. That might be the case for Nadine Matheson or John Grisham if they didn't like practicing law and this was their way of validating themselves and self-expressing. But at the other end of the spectrum, you could have an attorney in a high-powered law firm, high status, who hates their job but stays in it because they want that external validation. The Devil Wears Prada is a fun validation story. We see Andy transform. I'm not sure where she starts exactly, but she transforms through external validation. Remember that scene? Are those Chanel boots you're wearing? Yes, they are. To selling out, which is what her boyfriend accuses her of. And then she ends at internal validation when she quits on Meryl Streep and the fancy job. Hamilton is another example of a validation internal story dynamic. The question forced by validation is, what is my value in this world? People tend to think of Me Before You as a love story, and it is. But love is not the primary internal dynamic. Love is secondary. Love is what pressures Louisa to change and to force her to see her value, that she deserves a life she loves. Validation is the primary story dynamic of Me Before You. Worldview is the next internal story dynamic. The scale is from wisdom to knowledge to ignorance, ignorance masked as wisdom. These are often called coming-of-age stories, but you don't have to be a teenager to come of age. Heavy is a memoir. It's a wonderful memoir, and it's the only book to blow me away with subtext. Another example is The Book Thief. While the validation scale looks inward, the worldview scale looks outward, and the question worldview prompts is, how do I view the world? In worldview stories, the avatar often changes from a black and white view of the world to one that's more nuanced, has more shades of gray, and that's what happens in The Book Thief. Redemption is the last purely internal story dynamic. The scale is from altruism to selfishness, with gradations between and below. Cautionary tales are often failed redemption stories. Killers of the Flower Moon is an example of selfishness masked as altruism, hidden in the guise of love. The interesting thing to me is when I finish a cautionary tale, it often doesn't feel good. Even if the story is well written, well plotted, with powerful characters, the failed morality of it is disheartening. Yellowface is another example, an author who steals another author's manuscript with the implied theft of her cultural heritage. In the redemption internal story dynamic, the question that's at the heart is, what is my responsibility to others? This is the question that's at the heart of individualism versus collectivism, which has been an ongoing struggle in the United States. The United States, according to the work of Gerda Hofstede, which I studied in college, is the most individualistic country in the world. And I'm curious to see if we see a rise in stories with a redemption story dynamic because of the questions we're asking ourselves about what is my responsibility to others. That was our final internal story dynamic. Every story with a character arc needs at least one internal story dynamic and one external. If you're not sure what the primary internal story dynamic is in your story, just ask the questions. How is the avatar demanded to change? Is it their view of themselves, their self-worth, their view of the world, their responsibility to others, or their sacrifice for love? And when you can see what fits for your story, then you know whether you have a validation, worldview, horror, or love story. And yes, you can have a blend, and I strongly advise you to have one that's primary, because that will help you carry that thread or that jolt of energy all the way through the story. What matters is not how I categorize the dynamics or how you do. What matters is how you use them in your writing to tell a powerful story, especially when you're working at the 7 Jewels. That's where the story dynamics really matter. To help you do that, download the Story Dynamics Quick Guide so you have it at your fingertips. As always, if you have questions or thoughts, please use the comments so that I can respond. Story Dynamics often leads to questions, and I'd love to hear yours. Thank you for being here. See you next time for our exploration of external story dynamics. Tally ho.